The Gospel according to the 14th chapter of St. Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
This is just the first part of our Passion history reading for this morning. And I would recommend that either right now or immediately after this reading, you get your Bible ready for the rest of it. It's not all printed in here, but for now, we will read the first several verses of Mark chapter 14. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me." She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. The gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. And if you have young ones this morning who might like to join Heidi and the other kids here downstairs for junior church, they're welcome to head down at this time. Yeah, it's time to go, Seekers. They're always welcome to stay up here, of course, but there's a special lesson planned for them down there. I think they should bring their palms, too. Yes. Well, folks, I mentioned earlier, I'm new to this idea of a Passion History Sunday. What I'm used to, which we've been doing in the midweek services, is taking the Passion History and using an amalgamated gospel, where somebody goes through all the gospels and creates kind of a combined gospel history, and then you either read that in installments or you read it responsively, which is what we actually have been doing on Wednesday. We've been reading it responsively. And that's how you get through the Passion History each year. The alternative, which has become more and more popular among Lutherans in America in particular, is to make Palm Sunday Passion History Sunday. And then in each of the 3 different years where you have readings, there's a year A and a year B and a year C. You may not be familiar with that, but we have a 3-year reading cycle. So whatever we're reading on Lent 5 last week, this year we'll be reading again in 3 years. Year B now, and then there's C next, and then A after that. The idea of the Passion History Sunday is you read from Matthew in A, and then you read from Mark in B, and then you read from Luke in C. And any one of those years, you might read from John. You just kind of pick which one you want to do that. But that way, every year, you've read the Passion History, a couple of chapters of a gospel. A couple of chapters of a gospel takes a while to read. Not quite as long as I preach, but almost. I was okay with the idea of reading one of those Passion Histories, which we're going to do this morning. But I didn't like the idea that we would read 2 chapters straight through, because I don't think it's good for retention. I don't think it's good for understanding and making it a part of your own mind and psyche. I want to maximize our useful meditation as we read through this, get a little more out of it, I hope. So we're going to read this in portions. And then between those portions, there will just be a few comments to help us kind of take in what we've already read. And then we'll sing a stanza of a hymn. That hymn is hymn 115. So rather than reading that after the sermon, we're going to sing it during the sermon. That hymn, I believe, is completely new to you. However, that's rather unusual in Lutheran congregations, so I'm going to introduce it. The way that'll work is, right now, as a prayer to get our minds in order, I'm just going to sing stanza 1. Then, between the next two readings, we'll sing stanza 1 together, as long as you're comfortable. I'm going to have the organ play. When I say organ, I mean the computer in the back, because June's just going to try to sing. So hopefully this all works. I don't want it to be a distraction. I've tested it a few times. I'm doing better than I did last time I tried it. And so hopefully that'll work. This time, though, as a prayer to get our minds in order, I'm just going to sing a cappella the first stanza of Jesus I Will Ponder Now. You'll see kind of why that is. You'll see what a prayer for meditation this stanza really is. Jesus, I will ponder now on your holy passion. Let your Spirit now endow me for meditation. Grant that I in love and faith may the image cherish of your suffering, pain, and death, that I may not perish. Now, a helpful tip for meditation on gospel texts. Imagine yourself as one of the people in the text. For the reading we just had, with Mary pouring the perfume on Jesus, you could make yourself Mary and try to understand what it is to be Mary. Keep thinking about what Mary did and how she acted until you understand how you might act that way yourself. You could do that, but as the folks who were here on Wednesday discussed, it's a little hard to do that with Mary. We would like to think that we could be like Mary, but it's not likely that we would be like Mary. She's the only one who did anything to prepare for the death of Jesus. At least the only one that's recorded that did anything to prepare for the death of Jesus. Everybody else sat around listening to what Jesus was talking about, what they were going to do in Jerusalem, but explained it away or didn't retain it, or I don't know. It's easier to come up with reasons you didn't hear something God said, isn't it? So you could try Judas. That's distasteful. We don't like to think about being Judas. And I would recommend that when you're reading through the Gospels, you do try to understand Judas as a real person, that you understand, for instance, that the way the Gospels tell this story, this occasion of the perfume being wasted on Jesus appears to have set him off. John adds to this that even though the other Gospels say the disciples were joining in the pile on Mary, it was Judas who offered the complaint. The others just kind of played along. And he didn't do it because he cared about the poor. He did it because he cared about money. So this set him off. You could do that, but I'm going to recommend something else instead. I'm going to recommend that as I continue reading through the Passion history, you imagine yourself as Peter. Try, as I read, to imagine responding to things the way that Peter responds to them. And the reason I recommend Peter is because we're reading from Mark in this Passion history year. And Mark is the Gospel of Peter. We don't call it the Gospel of Peter because Mark wrote it. But the early church fathers all testify to the fact that Mark was a student of Peter's. And this is the stories as Peter would remember them. So try to imagine yourself as Peter. And I'll read the next portion. Again, you may want a Bible out. each person's going to be a little bit different. How do you absorb a lot of Scripture at once? When somebody's reading it from a pulpit, you may want a Bible in front of you. You may just want to listen. I would definitely recommend having the hymn in front of you, because we will be returning to singing all 4 stanzas one at a time as we go through this. I will be continuing now at Mark 14, verse 12. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." The disciples left, went into the city, and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me." "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go, just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. "You will all fall away," Jesus told them. "For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. Peter has been bold. And I doubt any of us would struggle with the idea that when Jesus says he's going to be betrayed, we would want to say, "Not me." Of course, that means that Peter's fall, that is coming shortly, was extra hard, doesn't it? Again, if you put yourself in his place, that's how you'd feel, right? You promised up and down to Jesus you'd never disown him. We see it coming. But in a sense, so does Peter. Not because he listened to what Jesus said. He denied what Jesus said. "No, I would never do that." But you know, of the 4 Gospels, only this one records that the cock crowed twice before the 3rd denial. And I can't help but think to myself, that's because Peter remembers this more vividly than the rest. To the others, it's like, who cares how many times that thing crowed? It crowed, that was the sign. But for Peter, he remembers this vividly. You got to remember that if you're going to try to put yourself in his shoes, don't you? By the way, in the section we're about to read, Mark shows up, we believe. He refuses to name himself. But if you can keep this in mind, when we get to the last verse of this next section, that young man being referred to, that's probably Mark. But that being said, to again give us a little time to digest and to prepare our hearts for more meditation, I'm going to ask you, if you're comfortable, to join in this time in hymn 115, I'm going to sing stanza 1 again, as part of all 4 stanzas being sung by the congregation. And this time, if I've done it right, we will also hear organ music over the speaker. Continuing now at verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the 3rd time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. I said that last person was probably Mark, didn't name himself. Do you notice who else he didn't name? Because we know from the other Gospels the one who cut off the high priest servant's ear, don't we? Peter. Peter painfully recounts all the attempts to stay awake. And then Peter remembers himself being brutal in front of the Prince of Peace. He doesn't even tell the story with the healing that John tells us Jesus then performed, putting the ear back in place. Perhaps you couldn't picture being Mary, because who listens that well, right? Probably best not to do that, but here, you can imagine being Peter, getting tired, right? I mean, to a degree, none of us can really help being tired. But when your friend is in distress, asks you to stay awake, when you can see him a stone's throw away in anguish, you might find some way to stay awake. And then later, in recounting the story, to realize I might have done that for a friend, and I was asked to do it for Jesus. And I failed at it. The flesh is weak. I don't want to be overly hard on Peter. Jesus rebuked him because he asked for him to stay awake. And I imagine Peter's response was, of course I will. But when we stand up for Jesus in ways that we imagine is right without listening to him, how can we help but look back on these occasions with some regret? I think Peter did. Quite a bit, in fact, only that's going to intensify, isn't it? Join me again. Stanza 2 of hymn 115. Continuing again at verse 53 of chapter 14. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days we'll build another not made with hands. Yet even then, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy! And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Even more painfully than not being able to stay awake, which is completely understandable. I can only imagine how it was for Peter trying to recall these events and share them with other people. And like I said, he shares them in more detail than the other gospel writers do. He gives to his personal student, his gospel writer, you could say. The gospel writer who wrote the least of all 4 of them, the shortest of the gospels, he gives them more detail about himself and his betrayal. He could have rationalized it in all kinds of ways, I'm sure. He could have even called it bravery because at least he followed. At least he went into the courtyard. But then the second crow. He had been warned and he didn't listen. And if you can't say that you know that feeling all too well, it's a good thing we slowed down for this meditation. We all need to be able to see that in ourselves. We all know that feeling. Join me again. Stanza 3 of hymn 115. Chapter 15 of Mark. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Though it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested, a man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him!" they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. You get different details from different Gospels. And these details seem consistent with somebody standing at a distance. I know it's difficult when you can hear the other Gospels in your head to focus on just the way one Gospel tells it, but I noticed little details about it. Like, almost nothing of what Jesus said is recorded here. When he shouted, that's recorded. You'll hear that in just a minute. But listen closely. Mark's Gospel will talk about Jesus making a loud noise, crying out. It'll talk about what's said in the crowd, as though Peter were trying to blend in or were just on the outskirts of those who were speaking. You know that feeling? Being a follower of Christ, but not quite wanting to stand out as a follower of Christ? This is our God on a cross. And so Mark's Gospel looks at Peter, its background author, with honesty, because God looks on us with honesty. More honesty than we use on ourselves. In fact, he finds more flaws than we do. But we are part of his crowd. Human failure of heart caused this death. So we belong in that crowd. But the point of this death is to show how far God will go to make sure we stay connected to him. Never forget that. Even as all the warts are brought into the spotlight, even if your own failure, your own past haunts you, never forget, we are part of that crowd. But that crowd wouldn't even exist if he didn't want us to know we are part of his crowd, his family, his children. And this is what the universe's most awesome Father does for his kids. Join me in stanza 4 of hymn 115.